It's the IDRH Digitalks podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. I'm your host, David Tamez, and on our third episode, we are speaking with Dr. Marcy Lascano. Dr. Lascano is a professor for the Department of Philosophy with a focus in early modern philosophy, including directed research in the philosophical works of Margaret Cavendish. The Digitalks podcast is produced by the University of Kansas and the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, IDRH for short. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third episode of the Digitalks podcast, a podcast about all things digital humanities. I'm your host, David Tamez, and our guest today is Dr. Marcy Lascano, a professor in the Department of Philosophy here at KU. Dr. Lascano, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I guess we can begin talking about your research interests and why you chose them.
Great. Well, I work mainly in 17th and 18th century philosophy, so we call it the early modern period in philosophy, and I work mainly on women philosophers who have been somewhat understudied and sort of traditionally, and I work mainly on their metaphysical views, although I do a little bit in what they call natural philosophy in the time period, which we would now call science, and a little bit of work on happiness as well.
And just, a brief for anyone that's not oriented in philosophy or academia generally, can you describe metaphysics? And because right now I think people have, in the general audience, they have a certain idea of metaphysics, in the Barnes and Noble section, metaphysics, but we philosophers mean something slightly different than what the general audience might.
Yes, that's true. You're right. Yes, it doesn't involve crystals. It does involve thinking about the nature of the world. So I focus on issues in ontology, which are like, what are the basic constituents of the world? So right now we might think that is something at the quantum level or like string theory or something like that. In the early modern period, it's usually a debate about whether matter exists and in what way it exists and how does it relate to spiritual substance, if there is such a thing. I also look at issues in causation, that is, how does one thing affect another, issues in perception that are related to causation, also sometimes fall into the metaphysics category, things about free will, the existence of God. So these are metaphysical issues that are of most concern in the early modern period, and those are the things that I work on as well.
And do you recall the moment, I guess because we all have a moment or a time period where we chose or decided to pursue these interests? Was there a moment for you or a time period where it really hit you that philosophy was the route for you?
Yeah, I did my undergraduate work at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I was actually an English major. I have a bachelor's degree in English and creative writing. And after I graduated, I continued to work at the University of Washington in the Office of Minority Affairs. And I had picked up some Plato. I don't know why, but I decided I was going to read Plato. And I started reading it, and I thought, I have no idea what's going on here, and I need some help. And as an employee at the University of Washington, I could take classes at night. And so I started taking some classes in the evenings in philosophy, and I just got hooked. And I ended up getting another bachelor's degree in philosophy and with a minor in classics. And at that point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to study ancient philosophy or if I wanted to do metaphysics or medieval philosophy. And it wasn't until I got to grad school, I went to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst for graduate school. And I went thinking I was probably going to do contemporary metaphysics, but I just kept taking history classes. And so I realized that what I liked was the kind of metaphysics that they did in the 17th and 18th century, which was a lot of system building. So there's these big, systems that you get. And I wrote my dissertation on Locke and Leibniz at that point.
So our discussion today is going to focus a little bit on a DH project that you've been conducting and I think is still ongoing. And it's around the works of Margaret Cavendish. Can you tell us a little bit about Margaret Cavendish?
I can. So Margaret Cavendish is 17th century woman philosopher. She was born in 1623 and died in 1673. So she's a rough contemporary of Descartes and Thomas Hobbes, who was actually a very good friend of the Cavendish family and they were his patrons. And she also met a lot of the natural philosophers of her time, including Joseph Glanville, and she had discussions about Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke. And so she's an interesting philosopher because she wrote a great deal of work that we have. She published her own philosophy under her own name, which at the time was very bold for a woman. Most women who did do any work in philosophy published anonymously. But Cavendish really wanted to express herself and wanted to be a famous philosopher. She wasn't paid a lot of attention by philosophers during her own time, although the people who worked in natural philosophy, the people who we would consider scientists now, did engage with her to some degree. But she wrote a number of plays. She wrote poetry. She wrote a science fiction work. She's the first woman, definitely, to have written a science fiction work. And she also wrote about 7 philosophical essays. So she, like I said, she was deeply interested in natural philosophy, although she does have a metaphysical system that develops throughout her works, but it's mainly in service of explaining the natural world. And she's a materialist like Thomas Hobbes, her friend, but she's also a vitalist, that is somebody who thinks that everything is alive. And she's also committed to panpsychism. She thinks that everything is minded to some extent. So everything is rational and sensitive in various degrees, according to Cavendish. So it makes her a sort of fascinating counterpoint to a lot of the early modern philosophers who were male at her time.
And to what extent, because I think an idea like panpsychism today, while given some degree of, legitimacy or is talked about today, is if it's no real problem, but it's still considered kind of an odd position to take. How much of it, of her not being, or other philosophers not engaging with her at the time, was about the views she held, and how much of it was the misogyny of the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to know exactly how much of it was due to her views. Certainly, there were plenty of philosophers at the time who were prejudiced against anybody who was a materialist, and Cavendish was. So Hobbes was often, ridiculed or disliked to some extent for his materialism, but he was also a mechanist philosopher, which was the prevailing view in the 17th century scientific world. So this is the idea that all animals and including human bodies and things like that move kind of by like machines. That's the way to think of it. And so although Hobbes had the wrong view about the nature of matter or the nature of the world, and that it's all material, right? And this really upset people. He even claims that God is material. He had the right view in science. So Cavendish was sort of on the outside of both of these issues, claiming materialism and also being a vitalist. So there were a number of vitalist philosophers in the 17th and early 18th centuries. So I don't think that is what kept her out, but certainly being a woman was one of the issues. And she does acknowledge that in her works. If you read her prefaces and things like that, after she published her first couple of books in philosophy, there were lots of rumors going around that her husband had written them rather than her. And so in the 1663 edition of Philosophical and Physical Opinions, you see him writing one of the prefaces saying, this isn't my work. And then again, at the end of the book, he has another piece where he tells people, well, clearly, this isn't my work because, as we all know, I believe that everything is salt. which I think is a much stranger view than early modern materialism and vitalism. But he's getting this from alchemy, right? So the idea is that, everything eventually is convertible into or made from salt. And he goes on to explain his views, which are much less believable than hers. But so Cavendish was continually trying to engage philosophers, including, most importantly, the Cambridge Platonist Henry More, who was the mentor of another woman philosopher who's a contemporary of Cavendish, Anne Conway. And I think that Cavendish was hopeful that Henry More would pay attention to her because he was so interested in Anne Conway's philosophy, and was an important influence on her. But Conway and More shared a commitment to a kind of spiritual world that Cavendish just simply doesn't have. And so I think that the materialism and the fact that she was a woman is what greatly kept her on the margins of philosophy.
And you mentioned that her and Anne Conway were contemporaries. Was there any interaction between the two?
There's no direct correspondence between the two of them. We know, so Cavendish used to send her books to Henry More. We have letters. We have a letter from Henry More where he's telling Conway that she's clearly trying to engage him in philosophical debate, but that he doesn't think that anyone will ever bother to engage with her. But he suggests that maybe Conway should because she's a woman. And it seems from reading the text that they probably did know about each other's views. In fact, there are a couple of places in Cavendish's text where she refers to Platonism, which is the view that kind of Neoplatonism, the view that Henry More held. And in those texts, she seems to refer to views also somewhat like Anne Conway's. Conway didn't publish until after she died, and so Cavendish was also no longer living at that point. But there were obviously, in London at that time and around, they generally knew of each other's views, I think. And certainly it seems that in Conway's book, she does talk about the kind of materialism that Cavendish had, but they don't mention each other's names ever.
And you mentioned she also has a science fiction work. And can you tell us a little bit about that work and whether there were any, if you have in mind or have come across any contemporary works or works after that may have been influenced by.
Sure. The science fiction work that Cavendish wrote is, we call it the Blazing World. It's technically a description of a new world called the Blazing World. It's the full title, and they don't like short titles in the 17th century. That's short for the 17th century. But Cavendish published this work, interestingly, along with a work of philosophy. So she has a work called Observations Upon Experimental Philosophy, where she's criticizing some of the claims of the experimental philosophers of her day. And the criticisms are philosophical criticisms. So she's concerned about the accuracy of the instruments they're using, the new telescopes and microscopes of the time. And she's also worried about the claims that they make about like the interior natures and being able to figure out the way the entire world works by these machines that they're developing. And so she, like Hobbes and Locke, is a critic of some of the early scientific moves that people are making. But so with this book of philosophy, she published at the back of it, connected to it, is The Blazing World. And she thought that the two works shed light on each other. So kind of like the way that Francis Bacon also wrote New Atlantis. So he has, of course, his scientific works, and then he has this work of, you might call it science fiction. Some people call it utopian fiction. Okay. So she's modeling that work, I believe. She published these two together for a reason. And in The Blazing World, she takes a sort of fantastic, she basically is trying to show us the way a world could be rather than the way that the world is, right? So this is a common move in science fiction, right? So you want to show the some things are not working very well in the world, and or that some things would be better in the world and could be better in the world, and so you invent your own world, right? So Cavendish tells us that she invents this world to illuminate her philosophical views. And in the world, it's a princess who gets kidnapped. The gods smile on her and kill all of her captors on the boat while it's heading towards the North Pole in a storm. And when it gets to the pole, she goes through the pole of the world, the North Pole, into another possible world. And there she meets fantastic creatures that are like half men and half animal. And she becomes the empress of that world, and she designs the world in this way that she thinks might work best for it. She eventually calls on the spirit of Margaret Cavendish as an advisor. So Cavendish plays multiple roles in this. She's the writer of it. She is, in some sense, the empress, and she gets to call on herself. And throughout the work, she not only criticizes the early modern scientists of the time through a kind of parody of them through these half animal, half persons that are doing like logic and micro science and things like that, but she also makes fun of Henry Moore and various other people. So it's I think a kind of charming and delightful work. She talks about the difficulties of creating a zombie army in it and things like that. So it's a fun piece to read, but it's hard to understand it if you haven't read any of her philosophy. So there's a reason she published them together. But as far as, she was certainly working in the tradition of Francis Bacon in publishing these works together. But she, as far as contemporary works that were inspired by Cavendish, there are a couple of newer novels that are inspired by the Blazing World. One is just called The Blazing World by Siri Hustvedt. And another one called A Description of the Blazing World by Michael Murphy. So there are several works that are based on or inspired by, I would say, Cavendish's works. And I should say that her plays and her poetry and her science fiction have been continually studied by people in the English department. It's only philosophy who, kind of ignored her after the 19th century and who's just rediscovered.
Because one story is, as I was looking at the synopsis of The Blazing World, for some reason I immediately thought of The Golden Compass.
Yeah.
Which includes similar, I think, characters and similar sort of fantastical elements. So I was thinking that I don't know if the writers of that novel were inspired by Cavendish. I haven't seen any statement of that sort, but those two were The Golden Compass reminded me of what happens in The Blazing World as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do agree that there are some similarities, especially Cavendish has bear men and they have the polar bears and the animals that talk, and the sort of way in which the spiritual beings are somehow separated from the bodies in Golden Compass. Cavendish also plays with that theme when she's talking about Henry Moore. So there's a lot of similarity there. And the descriptions of the Blazing World are somewhat similar. Yeah.
Now getting to your DH project, your project focuses on a particular work of Margaret Cavendish. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what else?
Yes. So I had an idea for a digital humanities project that I want to do in the future and that involved Margaret Cavendish. But one of the issues with doing that was that not all of her works are available online in searchable format. And so I wanted to make some progress towards getting that done. And I should say that a lot of the plays and poetry are available, but some of them are behind paywalls. But I was focusing on the philosophical works for now, and in particular, her second edition of Philosophical and Physical Opinions. The first edition was published in 1655, and it's about 170 pages long. But the second edition, which is not available anywhere online in a searchable, readable text, is about 500 pages long. Actually, it's a little over 500 pages if you count the tables at the end. And so this it's an important transitional text between Cavendish's early work and her later work. And so it's of great interest to scholars, but it's also not widely read and sometimes not even listed on websites that give you all of her works, which is kind of surprising. And I think this is because there isn't a searchable edition available. There isn't one on Early English Books Online, which is the resource for most early modern texts when you're searching them, at least not a searchable edition. There is an edition of it. So what I wanted to do was have a class that worked on this text and transcribed it and made it publicly available in a readable, searchable format. Unfortunately, the class did not get enough students to do this. And so basically, the only student who took the class became my research assistant. She did a great job. Her name is Rachel Henderson. And we decided that the best thing to do would be to have a transcribe-a-thon to get help from not only the KU community, but from the early modern community as well. And so with the help of Brian Rosenblum, we set up a transcription website that had the original 1663 text. And we opened it up and we got set up in the KU library, as you recall, since you were there. And we did transcribing from about 5 hours, I think, in the library and invited people all over the world to do so. The text was transcribed in less than 2 weeks. So we didn't finish it on the one-day transcribe-a-thon, but we got quite a bit of it done. And making some further calls to early modern people helped me finish it up by October 9th. We had started on September 27th. And at that point, we had all of the text transcribed. And then since then, I've been editing and proofreading it. And me and Brian Rosenblum have been setting up an ed site for it. So there is no public-facing site yet, but it should be done by early summer. And so the idea here was to make this text available to the early modern community.
And where do you hope to take this project, or what do you hope to come of it?
Yeah, I mean, besides just providing this resource, which I think is going to be great, I mentioned that I have another project that I would like to do. This is a bigger project. It's somewhat ambitious. The idea here is to use Cavendish's idea of creating a new world and to think about the possibility of what early modern philosophy would look like if instead of, as tradition has been, starting the period off by talking about somebody like Descartes, by talking about somebody like Margaret Cavendish. So the idea is if all the women hadn't fallen out in the 19th century, all the women who were known and who wrote and who corresponded with the men and who took part in the debates, if they hadn't just disappeared from our purview in the 19th century, what would early modern philosophy look like? And so the idea would be to start with Cavendish and look at the subjects that she talks about and the people that she talks about and move through the early modern period based on those ideas rather than a sort of traditional story that is often told in early modern classrooms. And so it's just really trying to emphasize the women and the subjects that the women talked about.
And do you have an inkling or an idea of what these subjects might be that might differ from the traditional?
Yeah. So the traditional story in early modern philosophy is that you begin with Descartes and you usually read the Meditations. Mm-hmm. This is the way it's taught. Most of us were taught early modern philosophy this way. I know I was. Perhaps you were too. And the idea is that you start with Descartes and then you consider the rest of the 17th and 18th century, probably even leading up to Kant, as the people who follow Descartes, who are the rationalists, right? So it's Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, and against the empiricists, who are Locke and Berkeley and Hume. And so you get this narrative that these philosophers were somehow against one another. It's usually based on epistemology, that is the study of knowledge, how we get our ideas, how we know something is true, that kind of stuff. And that's the story that most of us are told, and that all of this is somehow, this debate is resolved by Kant. We know that is a perfectly fine story to tell about the early modern period. It does have a kind of strong narrative pull, but it's not the only story to tell about the early modern period. And so one of the things that is interesting is if you look at people like Margaret Cavendish, what you're going to see is the emphasis in early modern science. And you're also going to see an emphasis on metaphysics. And you're going to see an emphasis on things like medicine, which we don't usually talk about. So medicine, chemistry, she was very interested in chemistry. She has writings that concern what we would call biology and physics, of course. She has lots of discussions about perception, about motion, and these are themes that you certainly do see in Descartes physics and things about motion and these kind of issues, but causation, of course. But they're not the emphasis in the stories that we tell about the early modern period. So what I want to do is not to exclude the men necessarily. That's not the point of it. The point of it is to see what other kinds of stories we can come up with about the early modern period, because philosophers have been telling this particular story about the early modern period for a really long time, and teaching this story to students makes it the case that they also later publish on these kinds of issues. And so we kind of gotten into a rut in thinking about the early modern period when it's a huge, interesting time, not only for science, but also in political philosophy, in ethics. And these stories are just left out. So Cavendish does have political works, also various types of works in social philosophy, and all of these things can really open up the way that we look at this period.
Was this your first DH project or movement into DH?
Yes.
And how'd you come across DH methods and DH generally?
Well, I knew about digital humanities, of course, but I wasn't quite sure what it was, like everybody else, I think, including everyone who's been introduced to it. But when I came to KU and we had an institute for the research in digital humanities, I wanted to take advantage of that. So this is only my second year at KU. I didn't have this at my old university. I didn't have these resources available. So I just went to information sessions and I met some faculty members, particularly like John Lamb in the English department, who's also interested in digital humanities. I went to some of the seminar presentations last year, and I learned a little bit about it. Having this particular project really made me want to learn more, right? So the idea that I could actually put this work out for the public made me want to learn things about digital humanities. So I'm still quite new at it, and I've had a lot of help from the Institute. I don't think I wouldn't have been able to do it without you and without Brian, who put in a lot of effort in designing the transcription site and who's helping me finish the final site. But so I know very little really, but I'm hoping to learn more.
And have you been able to think about, because this is a question I'm interested in too, but think about what DH can do for philosophy?
Yeah, I think there are great things that you can do with DH in philosophy. I think a lot of us have projects that could be brought into the classroom a bit more if we were willing to do the work of bringing in DH techniques. A lot of people in philosophy who work in areas that are kind of in between or that are interdisciplinary, philosophy and science or philosophy and psychology, these kind of areas, philosophy and economics, they do a lot of modeling. That kind of stuff could be brought into classrooms, and you could definitely use the resources to illustrate that kind of work and to help students understand the work that's being done. Text analysis, of course, is something that is interesting for historians of philosophy as well as in other disciplines. But I think for me, I wanted to have a kind of hands-on class in philosophy where students would not only learn about text, but they would also learn about how to present projects in a website form. So one of the things that Rachel and I did for the class was to create a website, which is really a mock-up of the bigger project that I wanted to do. So she helped me think about the ideas for presenting this new world in a digital format. So, like, how should we think about presenting the information in a way that's more visual, in a way that will keep people's attention, and in a way in which it's easily accessible, right? So these are skills that students can use in their real jobs later that they will have later, right? For those philosophy students who don't become philosophers, which is the vast majority of them, can then say that they were research assistants on projects, can also have a little bit of proficiency by creating digital projects. And they don't have to be websites, of course. They can be videos, they can be podcasts, they can be all sorts of things. And these are skills that I think that we should think about helping students build, and we can do that by really doing philosophical projects that are digitally enhanced.
And as we bring our conversation to a close, you're on your way to completing a DH project. What advice would you give to other humanists who want to engage in DH or start a DH project? And do you have any particular advice for philosophers?
Well, one thing is to realize that I think a lot of students don't know what digital humanities is. And as I said before, I don't think that that's uncommon. People are somewhat confused about what digital humanities is. And I think that's just because it can mean a lot of things.
Yeah.
And so I tried to sell the class as a digital humanities class, but I think students don't, because they don't know what it is, and it sounds like it's going to be a lot of work, tend to shy away. But certainly you can bring DH components into a class without calling it a digital humanities class. And these can be anything from text analysis to, bringing in various project-based things that can be presented digitally with just the option of it. So I would say to when you first start introducing these kind of components, to start small. That's a good thing for faculty to do. And to expect students not to be as digitally or as familiar with the technical components as we might think that they are. For some reason, we think that all of the young kids know how to do everything, but that's not exactly true. They're users of technology, not necessarily creators of it. So we have to keep that in mind. As far as seeking help, I think that the best thing that I did was just going to meet with staff at IDRH and just telling them about the things that I was interested in doing, and then having them give me feedback, right? Like, how could this be done? What could we do to help you? And it was amazingly helpful. I just learned a lot, and I have learned about the resources that I can use at the university and the things that are available to faculty for developing these kind of skills. For philosophers, I think it's really just a matter of thinking a little bit differently about our projects. We tend to work alone, and we tend to like that. And I like working alone as well. But sometimes there are things that we could use help. If we're thinking about larger projects that we might be doing that are grant-based projects, perhaps for the NEH or the NSF, something like that, we might consider ways in which we can bring students into those projects, either in the classroom or as paid assistants, right? Or for graduate students or undergraduate students who can work on various aspects of projects that are digital. A lot of the grant awarding agencies now want some sort of public face on your projects. And so it's a perfect opportunity to bring in some digital humanities to not only show the public what we're doing, but to get students involved and to get them the skills that will help them later.
Well, Marcy, thank you for having this conversation with me, and thank you for the work that you've been doing so far in DH.
Well, thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Digitalks.